By the time the county agricultural assessor rolled onto the Carter farm, half the town had already gathered beside the old barn. Some came because they had heard the property was finally being sold. Others came to watch Wade Mercer prove what he had been saying for months, that the little girl had packed the building with so much rotten wood that the barn itself was no longer worth saving. Wade stood near the entrance with his thumbs hooked beneath the straps of his overalls. He glanced at the warped doors and smiled at the men around him. "I warned Daniel," he said loudly. "You let a child drag forest trash into a barn. Sooner or later, the whole place starts rotting with it." A few people laughed. 11-year-old Ellie Carter heard every word. She stood at the bottom of the barn steps in muddy boots and the faded green coat that had once belonged to her mother. A brass key rested in her palm. Her fingers were wrapped around it so tightly that its teeth pressed red marks into her skin. Behind her, Daniel Carter looked older than he had that spring. 3 failed harvests, a broken tractor, and a stack of unpaid notices had bent his shoulders in ways farm labor never had. The assessor opened a leather folder. The bank had requested his report before deciding whether the Carter loan deserved one final extension. "Mr. Carter, I need to inspect the interior before I complete the agricultural use valuation," he said. "Mr. Mercer claims the structure may have suffered moisture, insect, and floor damage." Wade gave Ellie a sideways look. "Claims?" he said. "You can smell those logs from the road." But the air around the barn did not smell sour. It smelled cool, earthy. Like the woods after rain, the assessor noticed it too. His expression changed as a faint current slipped through the gap beneath the doors. Daniel stepped closer to his daughter. "Ellie," he whispered, "once we open this, there's no hiding it anymore." She looked past him at the field her father might lose, then at the barn Wade intended to tear down, then at the neighbors who had laughed each afternoon as she dragged blackened logs home in a child's red wagon. "I wasn't hiding it," she said. She climbed the steps. The crowd fell quiet as she pushed the key into the rusted lock. Metal scraped against metal. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the lock turned. Ellie pulled one door open only a few inches. A breath of damp, forest-scented air drifted into the sunlight. Someone near Wade stopped laughing. Inside the darkness, pale shapes covered the stacked logs like hundreds of small, silent shelves. The assessor lowered his folder. "What in the world is growing in there?" Ellie opened the door wider, and 5 months earlier, when she had dragged home the first log everyone called rotten, no one in town could have imagined the answer. 5 months earlier, the Carter farm had looked tired even before the sun came up. The cornfield behind the house stood uneven and pale. Half the irrigation pipes were patched with tape, and the old tractor had not moved since its transmission failed in June. Each morning, Daniel Carter opened the mailbox with the caution of a man expecting bad news. That Tuesday, he found another white envelope from the bank. Ellie watched from the kitchen window as her father read it beside the road. He did not tear it up or curse. He simply folded it once, placed it in his shirt pocket, and remained there for a long time. At breakfast, he pushed his eggs around the plate. "How much longer?" Ellie asked. Daniel looked up. "How much longer for what? Before we have to leave?" The fork stopped in his hand. Children were not supposed to understand overdue notices, property assessments, or final extensions. But Ellie understood silence. She understood the way her father lowered his voice during phone calls and stopped speaking whenever she entered the room. "We're not leaving today," he said. It was not an answer. That afternoon, Wade Mercer arrived in a polished truck and walked the property, as if it already belonged to him. He examined the empty chicken coop, the cracked fence posts, and the sagging barn roof. "The land is producing," he told Daniel. "The barn needs more repairs than it is worth. My offer is fair. It's half what my father paid for it." That was when the place had value. Ellie stood behind the screen door, listening. Wade pointed toward the barn. "I'd tear that down first. Nothing but old boards, mouse nests, and memories." After he left, Daniel sat on the porch steps with his face in his hands. Ellie slipped away before he could see her watching. She entered the barn through the side door. Dust floated in narrow beams of light. Most of the stalls had been empty since her mother died, and Daniel rarely came inside anymore. In the back corner, beneath a canvas sheet, Ellie found 3 wooden boxes filled with her mother's belongings. There were seed packets, garden labels, dried herbs, and a small notebook swollen from years of damp air. Its pages contained sketches of compost piles, planting rows, mushrooms, and fallen trees. Near the middle, Ellie found an unfinished sentence written in her mother's careful handwriting. "A fallen tree can feed a forest long after it stops standing." Below it was a drawing of short logs covered with layered fan-shaped growths. Ellie traced the picture with one finger. Outside, thunder rolled beyond the hills. By nightfall, the storm had begun tearing trees from the ground. The storm lasted until dawn. By morning, the road beyond the Carter farm was buried beneath broken limbs, leaves, and strips of bark. 2 old maples had fallen across the eastern fence, and somewhere near the Mercer lumberyard, a pine had crushed an empty storage shed. For the next 3 days, chainsaws echoed through the valley. Wade Mercer's crew worked from sunrise to dusk, hauling away the straight trunks and clean sections of hardwood. Anything thick, unscarred, and easy to sell went onto the trucks. Everything else was thrown into a growing pile beside the yard. The rejected pieces were crooked, cracked, rain-blackened, or softened at the ends. Moss clung to some of the bark. Other sections had begun decaying where old wounds had let water inside. People called the entire heap rotten, but most of the trees had been on the ground only a few days, and many of the short oak, maple, and beech sections still had dense, solid wood beneath their damaged outer layers. Wade planned to burn the pile before the end of the week. Ellie found it while walking home from the general store. She stopped at the roadside and stared to everyone else. The heap looked like storm waste. To Ellie, it looked like the drawings in her mother's notebook. She climbed carefully over the lower branches and crouched beside a short oak round. Its outer edge was black and soft, but when she pressed her thumb against the cut end, the pale center resisted her. She peeled back a loose strip of bark. Beneath it ran a thin web of white threads. Ellie leaned closer. The lines spread through the damp surface like tiny roots. Though she knew they were not roots, she had seen the same kind of network sketched beside her mother's notes about mushrooms and fallen trees. She did not know what species had made it. She did not know whether it was useful or dangerous, but it proved that dead wood could still hold a living process. "What are you doing in there?" Ellie turned. Wade stood behind her with a fuel can in one hand looking, she said. "At rot?" She pointed to the oak round. "Can I have this one?" Wade laughed. "For firewood? No, then what?" Ellie hesitated. She had a clue, not yet a plan. Wade called to 2 workers loading the last good boards. "Boys, the Carter girl wants to start her own lumber company." The men grinned. Ellie kept one hand on the log. "Can I take it or not?" Wade looked at the burn pile, then at her muddy shoes and thin arms. "Take all you want," he said. "Saves me from burning it." He walked away, still laughing. Ellie returned an hour later with a small red wagon. The oak round was heavier than it looked. Mud soaked through her knees, and a splinter cut her palm before she managed to lift one end over the side. At last the wood dropped into the wagon with a dull thud. As Ellie pulled it toward home, the wheels sank into the soft road. Behind her waited a pile the town had already judged. Ahead of her, the empty barn waited for her to learn the difference between wood that was useless and wood that only looked that way. The next afternoon, Ellie returned to the lumber yard. Then she came back the day after that. Each time she brought the same red wagon and selected only a few pieces from the enormous pile. She ignored the pine, the branches that crumbled under her fingers, and the logs that smelled sour beneath the bark. Instead, she searched for oak, maple, and beech with solid centers. At first, no one paid much attention, but by the end of the week, people had begun waiting for her. Workers leaned against the lumber stacks as she inspected the rejected wood. Customers slowed their trucks to watch the small girl roll logs over with a broken fence post, tap their ends with a stone, and mark them with pieces of colored chalk. Blue meant the center was still firm. Yellow meant the wood might be useful for something else. Red meant she would leave it behind. Wade found the entire process hilarious. "Careful," he called one afternoon. "She might discover gold under that bark." The workers laughed. Ellie continued examining a short section of oak. "Maybe she is building furniture," one man said. "Out of rot? Then maybe she is feeding termites." The nickname began with one of the boys from Elias school. He saw her pulling the wagon along the main road and shouted, "There goes the rotten log girl." By the next morning, everyone seemed to know it. Children repeated it outside the general store. Adults smiled when she passed, even Mrs. Talbot at the post office asked whether Ellie planned to bring the whole forest home. Ellie never explained. Every evening, she dragged her collection into the barn and locked the doors behind her. Inside, she measured each log, copied the tree type into her mother's notebook, and studied the condition beneath the bark. Some pieces were too soft and went into a separate pile. Others had strange colored growths she did not trust, so she carried them back outside. Only the best pieces remained near the center of the barn. Daniel noticed the growing stacks. "We can to let this place become a dumping ground," he warned. It won. "To what are you doing with them?" Ellie looked toward her mother's open notebook. "I am still figuring that out." Daniel sighed, but he did not order her to stop. The following evening, rain turned the road into deep mud. Ellie's wagon sank halfway home. 2 men passed in a truck, laughing as she struggled with the handle. Neither offered to help. Ellie pulled until her hands blistered and the wheels finally broke free. Behind her, the town saw a foolish child hauling rotten wood. Ahead of her, the barn was slowly becoming something none of them could yet recognize. Ellie began with the library. The oldest farming books were kept on a shelf near the back, where the pages smelled of dust and glue. She searched for anything about mushrooms. Fallen trees, damp hardwood, or the white threads she had found beneath the bark. Most of the books were too technical. Some warned that wild mushrooms could be dangerous even when they resembled edible varieties. Others explained that the visible mushroom was only the fruiting body of a larger network hidden inside wood or soil. That hidden network had a name: mycelium. Ellie wrote the word carefully in her mother's notebook. She also learned something that changed her plan. Finding unknown white threads in a log did not make the log safe to eat from, and heavily decayed wood was poor material for a controlled crop. A grower needed a known strain, a suitable hardwood, clean tools, moving air, and wood that remained solid enough for the chosen fungus to colonize. The town had called every rejected section rotten. The books taught Ellie to separate appearance from condition. She divided her collection into 3 groups. Anything with colored growth, sour odor, insect galleries, or a crumbling center went to a compost pile behind the barn. Logs with unknown natural mycelium were kept apart for observation and never used for food. Only recently fallen oak, maple, and beech rounds with sound interiors remained on the central racks. Then Ellie spent nearly all the money in her small savings jar. From a reputable farm supplier, she ordered a fast-fruiting cultivated oyster mushroom strain. The packet included numbered spawn plugs, preparation instructions, and a warning never to mix the crop with unidentified wild mushrooms. When the package arrived, the plugs looked disappointingly ordinary small wooden dowels covered with pale growth. But the supplier S diagram resembled one of the unfinished sketches in her mother S notebook. Using a hand drill, borrowed from Ruth Keller, Ellie made closely spaced rows of holes along the first short oak round. Ruth stood beside her, steadying the wood and refusing to let Ellie operate the drill alone. Ellie pushed a spawn plug into each opening and sealed it with warm wax from an old candle. The work was slow. Her wrists ached, the drill slipped once. Wax stung the side of her thumb. Still she continued until 20 carefully selected logs stood in neat rows on wooden supports above the barn floor. She hung damp burlap nearby without letting it touch the bark and placed shallow pans of water between the racks. Each morning before school, she checked the temperature. Each afternoon, she recorded the condition of the wood, the smell of the room, and the moisture in the air. For 2 weeks nothing changed. The logs remained dark, silent, and ordinary. Then one evening, Ellie noticed a faint white circle spreading from one of the sealed holes. She did not touch it. She compared it with the supplier's booklet, checked the tag on the log, and wrote down the date. Something had begun moving deeper into the wood. Ellie smiled and opened her mother's notebook. Beside the unfinished sentence about fallen trees, she wrote, "The barn is not storing dead wood. It is growing a forest no one can see yet." Ellie mistook moisture for safety. Every instruction she had read warned that the inoculated logs must not dry out, so she soaked the burlap twice each morning and filled the water pans to the rim. At night, she closed every window and pushed old feed sacks beneath the barn doors to keep the damp air from escaping. For several days, the barn felt exactly as she imagined a forest should feel cool. Dark and wet, then the smell changed. It began near the back wall, not the clean scent of rain or soil, but something sharp and sour. Ellie followed it to a maple log marked with blue chalk. A patch of green dust had appeared around one of the drilled holes. By the next morning, it had doubled. 2 nearby logs developed gray fuzz beneath their bark. Tiny flies circled the water pans. When Ellie lifted a dripping burlap sheet, a cloud of insects rose toward her face. She dropped it and stumbled backward. The clean white growth she had watched so carefully was disappearing beneath something unfamiliar. Ellie wiped the green patch with a cloth. It returned the next day. She scraped away a section of bark. The contamination had already spread deeper. Soon, the barn smelled strongly enough for Daniel to notice from the yard. He opened the side door and froze. "What happened in here?" Ellie stood between the rows of logs, holding a stained cloth behind her back. "It's just a few bad spots." Daniel stepped farther inside. Flies drifted through the weak afternoon light. Water had gathered beneath the racks, and one corner of the floorboards had begun to darken. "This is in a few spots. I can fix it." "With what money?" The question struck harder than anger. Daniel looked at the wet floor, the contaminated logs, and the sacks Ellie had pressed against the doors. "We cannot afford damage to this barn," he said, "and we cannot sell food grown in a place we cannot keep clean." Her eyes dropped to the floor. "I was trying to save it, I know." His voice softened, but he did not ignore the danger. "The bad logs go outside today. The windows stay open. The floor dries before anything comes back in. And if you try again, Ruth helps us inspect the room first." Ellie swallowed. "You are not making me stop. I am making you stop doing it this way." Together, they marked every suspicious log and carried it to a separate pile far from the garden. Daniel propped open the doors, emptied the standing water, and laid scrapboards over the damp corner so air could reach it. Wade Mercer happened to be driving past. He slowed when he saw the green-stained wood beside the barn. "Looks like the garbage finally defeated her," he called. His laughter followed the truck down the road. That evening, Ellie sat alone on the barn steps. The experiment had not failed because the town was cruel. It had failed because she had misunderstood something. She opened her mother's notebook and reread the page describing moisture. Then she noticed a line she had skipped before. "Keep the wood damp, but let the forest breathe." The next morning, Ellie opened every window in the barn. Cold air moved through the building, carrying the sour smell out through the rafters. She removed the feed sacks from beneath the doors, emptied the standing water, and lifted each remaining log onto higher wooden rails. Then she began again. This time, she did not treat every piece of wood as if it needed the same care. The logs with clean bark and firm centers stayed together. Anything with green dust, black slime, or a sharp smell went outside. She scrubbed the tools, washed the water pans, and burned the stained cloths she had used before. Ruth Keller found her working after school. The old woman stood in the doorway, watching Ellie turn a heavy oak log with both hands. "You were still doing this?" Ruth asked. Ellie nodded. "Your father said the first batch went bad. It did. And that didn't change your mind? It changed what I was doing." Ruth smiled faintly. Together, they repaired 2 broken window latches and stretched wire mesh across the openings to keep larger insects out. Ruth showed Ellie how to hang the damp burlap without letting it touch the logs. "Wet things pressed together stay sick," she said. "Air has to move between them." Ellie wrote the sentence in her notebook. For the next 10 days, she followed a stricter routine. She misted the logs lightly instead of soaking them. She opened the barn at dawn and closed only the lower shutters. At night, she checked the smell before she checked the temperature. Nothing happened quickly. The logs did not suddenly bloom. No miracle appeared beneath the candle wax. But the flies disappeared, the sour odor faded, the spreading green patches stopped. One evening, Ellie examined the cut end of the first oak log. Fine white lines had begun to reach outward from the center. Following the grain of the wood, they looked stronger than before. Not fuzzy, not dusty, they formed a pale network beneath the surface, like frost trapped inside the tree. Ellie called Daniel. He entered reluctantly, expecting another problem. She held a lantern beside the log. "See those lines?" Daniel leaned closer. "What are they? The part that grows before the mushroom?" He studied the wood for a long moment. "So it is alive?" Ellie shook her head. "The tree is tea." She touched the white pattern gently. "But something is still using what it left behind." Daniel looked around the cleaner barn, the raised racks, the open windows, the careful rows. For the first time, he did not see a child's collection of rotten logs. He saw an experiment that had survived its first mistake before leaving. He helped Ellie turn the heaviest log. Neither of them noticed Wade Mercer's truck slowing on the road outside. For nearly a month, the barn gave Ellie nothing she could show anyone. The white lines continued spreading beneath the cut ends of several logs, but no mushrooms appeared. The wood remained quiet, and the people outside grew louder. At school, the nickname followed her through the hallway. "Rotten Log Girl." At the general store, 2 farmers joked that Daniel should charge admission to the barn before it collapsed. Wade Mercer began telling people he would soon own the Carter property and turn the building into a storage shed. Ellie stopped answering them. Each morning she checked the logs before sunrise. Each evening she wrote the same words in her notebook. No visible growth. Moisture stable. No new contamination. The entries became harder to make. One Thursday, Daniel returned from town, holding another bank letter. "They moved the inspection forward," he said. Ellie looked up from the kitchen table. "How long? 12 days. And after that?" Daniel placed the envelope beside the unpaid bills. "If they don't see a reason to extend the loan, we'll have to accept an offer." He did not say Wade's name. He did not need to. That night, Ellie entered the barn alone. Rain tapped against the roof. The logs stood in dark rows, exactly as they had the night before and the night before that. She ran her hand over the first oak log. Nothing the second. Nothing at the third rack. She stopped. For the first time, her mother's notebook felt less like a guide and more like a promise made by someone who was no longer there to explain it. "What if I misunderstood all of it?" Ellie whispered. The barn answered only with the soft movement of air through the open vents. She found an empty feed sack and began removing the wax-sealed plugs from a failed maple log. By midnight, she had dragged 3 pieces toward the door. She planned to burn them before Daniel woke. Then her lantern slipped from its hook. It swung low, throwing light across the cut end of an oak log near the back wall. Ellie froze. A pale ring had formed beneath the surface, not a stain, not mold. The white network had thickened and reached nearly to the bark. She lifted the lantern closer. Another log showed the same pattern. Then another. The barn had not been empty. It had been working where no one could see. Ellie slowly returned the feed sack to the floor. She opened her notebook and crossed out the words "no visible growth." Underneath, she wrote, "Silence is not the same as failure." Outside, Wade's truck passed along the road. Inside, the hidden forest was almost ready to reveal itself 3 mornings later. The temperature dropped. A cold mist settled over the fields, silvering the fence wire and darkening the barn roof. Ellie entered before sunrise with her lantern in one hand and her notebook tucked beneath her arm. She checked the first rack. Nothing. The second rack. Still nothing. At the third, she noticed a small bump beneath the bark of an oak log. It was no larger than the head of a nail. Ellie leaned closer. The bump was brown, smooth, and slightly curved. It had pushed through a crack near one of the wax-sealed holes on a log tagged with the supplier S-batch number. She did not touch it. Instead, she circled the location in her notebook, recorded the time, and checked the log's inoculation record. By afternoon, the bump had opened like a tiny folded umbrella. The next morning, 2 more appeared beside it. Ellie called Daniel into the barn. He squinted at the cluster. "Those are mushrooms? They look like the brown oysters we planted." "Look like?" Ellie opened the supplier booklet and compared the cap, stem, growth pattern, and clustered shape with the cultivated variety. The pictures matched, but she remembered every warning from the library books. A resemblance was not enough. She wrapped one mature specimen in clean paper, copied the log number onto the package, and carried it to Ruth Keller. Ruth drove the sample, the supplier label, and Ellie S. records to a commercial mushroom grower in the next county. The grower examined the specimen in person. He asked about the spawn source, the hardwood species, the inoculation date, the smell, and the way the cluster had emerged. He also made Ellie promise that no mushroom from an untagged or naturally colonized log would ever enter a sales basket. Only after comparing the sample with the supplier S strain did he confirm that it was the cultivated brown oyster mushroom Ellie had introduced. When she returned to the barn, the small cluster had nearly doubled in size. Within a week, several tagged oak logs began producing. The harvest filled only one shallow basket. It was not enough to rescue a farm. It was barely enough to fill a table. Still, Ellie carried the basket, the supplier record, and the grower's written confirmation to the general store. Mrs. Talbot examined the mushrooms as if Ellie had brought in jewels. "Did these really grow in that old barn?" Ellie nodded. Mrs. Talbot agreed to buy a small amount for the store's weekend customers. The payment was $12. Ellie brought the money home in a white envelope and placed it beside the bank notice. Daniel opened it, counted the bills, and then counted them again. $12, he said. Ellie lowered her eyes. "I know it is too much, no." His voice broke slightly. "It's proof." That evening, he nailed a new board across the weakest section of the barn floor. Ellie returned to the racks with her lantern. On a tagged log near the back wall, 5 new caps were pushing through the bark. For the first time, the hidden forest was no longer hidden. The $12 did not save the Carter farm, but it changed the way Daniel looked at the barn. The next morning, he carried in a stack of scrap boards and built stronger racks along the eastern wall. He repaired a leaking section of roof, raised the water pans off the floor, and fitted a simple latch to the largest window. Ellie watched him work without saying anything. Finally, Daniel looked over his shoulder. "You need more room, don't you?" She smiled. The second harvest was larger than the first. Instead of cutting every mushroom at once, Ellie recorded which logs produced early, which needed more time, and which showed no clean growth. She marked each rack with inoculation dates and began rotating the logs so they would not all fruit together. Some were resting, some were beginning to show pale knots beneath the bark. Others were ready to harvest. The barn was no longer a collection of experiments. It had become a production schedule. Mrs. Talbot sold the first basket before noon and asked for a regular weekend supply. Then a cook from a small restaurant in the next town drove out to the farm. He examined the mushrooms, checked the supplier records, and walked slowly between the tagged racks. "I can promise a large order," he said, "but if the quality stays like this, I'll take a basket every week for the next 12 weeks. He wrote the quantity price range and delivery day on a simple purchase agreement and signed it at the washing table. Ellie copied the agreement into her notebook. During the next 2 harvests, the barn produced between 15 and 22 pounds a week. The income was modest, but it was repeatable. Daniel placed every receipt in a folder with the spawn invoices, rack costs, projected harvest dates, and signed orders. Nothing went to waste. Logs that had finished producing were broken into smaller pieces and added to the compost pile behind the barn. Soft wood that had never been suitable for mushrooms was mixed with leaves and manure. Months later, the dark material was spread through the exhausted vegetable beds. The soil held moisture longer. Cool season seedlings that had struggled in the dry ground began standing greener and stronger. Daniel noticed first. "The barn is feeding the garden now," he said. Ellie nodded. The logs still had another job. Ruth helped sew heavy cloth curtains to protect the racks from sudden temperature changes. Daniel built a washing table from old lumber. Ellie created a chalkboard with harvest dates, sanitation checks, moisture readings, and delivery orders. Above it, she painted 3 words: Carter Woodland Mushrooms. By the end of the month, the income still could not erase the debt or repair the tractor. But Daniel no longer had only hope to show the bank he had verified sales. A 12-week buyer commitment, a production schedule, safer infrastructure, and a small but measurable stream of farm income. The inspection was 4 days away, across town. Wade Mercer heard about the restaurant agreement. He laughed when someone told him. "A few mushrooms want to save a farm," he said. Then he learned the county agricultural assessor planned to inspect the barn and send his report to the lender. That afternoon, Wade drove past the Carter property twice. On his second trip, he saw Daniel carrying labeled baskets toward the house. For the first time, Wade did not smile. The county assessor arrived just after 10 in the morning. His truck rolled slowly up the Carter driveway, followed by Wade Mercer's polished pickup and 2 neighbors who claimed they had only come to watch. By the time Ellie stepped outside, more people were gathering near the barn. Wade greeted the assessor before Daniel could. "You'll want to inspect the floor first," he said. "The girl packed that place with wet timber. I wouldn't be surprised if the beams are full of beetles." The assessor opened a leather folder. "I'll make my own evaluation, Mr. Mercer." Wade smiled, of course. Daniel stood beside Ellie at the bottom of the steps. He had shaved that morning, but exhaustion still showed around his eyes. Inside the house, the bank notice waited on the kitchen table. If the assessor found the barn damaged or useless, the property value would fall. Wade's offer might become the only one Daniel could accept. Ellie carried a wooden box beneath one arm. Wade noticed it. "What's that?" he asked. "A basket of miracles." Several people laughed. Ellie set the box on an old barrel and opened it. Inside were her records. There were receipts from Mrs. Talbot's store, a signed weekly order from the restaurant, photographs of the first harvest, temperature charts, moisture notes, and a page listing which logs were resting, fruiting, or ready to be replaced. The assessor lifted one receipt. "You sold all of this from the barn?" "Not all at once," Ellie said. "The logs are scheduled, so they produce at different times." Wade gave a short laugh. "She made $12 on the first basket. That doesn't turn a wreck into a business." "No," Ellie replied. "The first basket proved the system worked." Daniel looked at her, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. The assessor examined the compost records next. "And this material. Logs that are too soft for growing are broken down and mixed with leaves and manure. We used the finished compost in the vegetable beds." The assessor glanced toward the rows of greener plants behind the house. Wade crossed his arms. "Paperwork doesn't change what's inside that building." He stepped toward the barn doors. "Open it, then let everyone see the pile of rot." The crowd shifted closer. Ellie picked up the brass key. For months, those people had watched her pull the red wagon through mud. They had laughed when she marked the logs, laughed when the first batch failed, and laughed when she kept working after there was no visible result. Now they stood waiting for her failure to have a smell, a shape, and an open door. Daniel leaned toward her. "Are you certain?" Ellie looked at the barn, then at Wade. "I wasn't hiding it." She climbed the steps and pushed the key into the rusted lock behind her. Someone laughed one final time. Then the lock turned. Ellie pulled the left barn door toward her. The hinges groaned. At first the crowd saw only darkness. Then morning light poured across the floor and climbed the rows of stacked logs. Hundreds of brown oyster mushrooms spread from the bark in layered clusters. Some were no larger than coins. Others opened like shelves along the oak and maple, their edges pale and clean. The racks stretched from one wall to the other, separated by narrow paths covered with dry wood chips. No one spoke. The barn did not smell rotten. It smelled like rain, leaves, and living soil. Cloth curtains moved gently near the open windows. Water pans rested on raised platforms. Each rack carried a wooden tag marked with a date, tree species, supplier batch, and stage of growth. Along the eastern wall stood baskets ready for delivery. Above them hung a hand-painted sign, "Carter Woodland Mushrooms." The assessor stepped inside. He examined the repaired floor, the ventilation openings, the clean washing table, and the spacing between the logs. Then he studied Ellie's chalkboard. "Harvest schedule," he said quietly. Ellie nodded. "These rows produce at different times. The restaurant takes 1 basket each week for 12 weeks. The store buys the smaller weekend harvests." Daniel handed him the signed agreement, sales receipts, supplier invoices, and production records. The assessor read them twice. Near the back of the barn, trays of green seedlings stood in dark compost. Beside them were bins labeled with leaves, manure, bark, and spent wood. "What happens when the logs stop producing?" he asked. "We break them down," Ellie said. "They feed the compost. The compost feeds the garden." He looked through the open rear door toward the vegetable beds. For months, those rows had been pale and weak. Now their leaves stood green above soil, darkened with organic material. Wade entered last. His eyes moved across the racks until he stopped at one oak log near the center. A streak of blue paint remained on its cut end. It was the mark used at Mercer Lumberyard. Wade touched it. That came from my burn pile. Ellie looked at him. Yes. He stared at the mushrooms growing from wood he had called worthless. A few logs done to change the value of this farm. The assessor closed his folder. No, he said, but a repaired agricultural structure, documented production, verified sales, standing orders, and improved soil due. The words settled over the crowd. Daniel lowered his head, breathing slowly. The assessor turned to him. My report cannot erase your debt and it cannot force the bank to approve an extension, he said. But I will not classify this barn as a liability. It is an operating agricultural structure with documented income potential. For the first time that morning, Wade had nothing to say. Ellie stepped beside the marked oak log. You saw the outside, she told him. You just stopped looking too soon. The crowd began drifting away before noon. 5 days later, the bank approved a 6-month extension conditioned on weekly deposits from mushroom sales and a new repayment review at the end of winter. It was not forgiveness. It was time the one thing Wade's distressed offer had been designed to take away. Daniel declined the offer in writing. Through the winter, Carter woodland mushrooms remained small. Some weeks were better than others. A few logs failed. Ellie discarded them, recorded the reason, and began again. The restaurant renewed its order. Mrs. Talbot added a second shelf at the store, and the compost helped Daniel prepare the first healthy vegetable beds the farm had seen in years. Above Ellie's work table, her mother's unfinished sentence remained open in the notebook. A fallen tree can feed a forest long after it stops standing. Ellie added one final line beneath it. Sometimes people call a thing worthless because they never wait to see its second life. Behind her, another small cluster pushed through the bark, and no one laughed.